Okay, we'll just start with discussing something that we're going to be moving more forcefully with in the immediate period, something which I think will completely upset the apple cart of the environmentalists and their ilk, which is a forward motion with this NAWAPA 21 project. Now, this is something which a pamphlet has recently been finished that's going to be disseminated en masse as part of a process of recruiting the American population to get behind the one economic policy which can save the United States and the planet right now, in conjunction with what you've put forward as Glass-Steagall, the credit system, and then the implementation of that credit system with this NAWAPA 21 project. Now, just for people who don't know, this is the 21st century version of the North American Water and Power Alliance project, something originally conceived in the 1960s, but something which was killed with the murder of Kennedy. With the murder of Kennedy, you had really the elimination of all forward progress on this, well, not on the planet, but in the United States, and it had a planetary effect. What this calls for is, in effect, a complete transformation of the globe in terms of bringing a greater control on the part of man over global processes, such as weather processes, such as the global water cycle. That for the first time, the control of processes such as the weather will be, to a large extent, brought wholly under the control of mankind. That will, in a sense, gain a certain independence from sort of external factors of the biosphere, to where now man becomes a willful controller of the biosphere as a whole. What the project calls for, just some simple elements of it, it's about 138 million acre-feet of water per year moved down that would otherwise flow into the ocean, but instead redirected onto land for major irrigation, other types of water needs. Would require the building of large dams, canals, a whole slew of things, which I'm not going to go through all the details now. But, for example, one of the effects would be that for the United States, we would be doubling our irrigable land in terms of food growing, things of this sort. Now, it's something that would then also, as we've discussed, be a greening of the deserts, taking the great American desert and greening it, taking areas of the globe which are right now either deserts or are close to deserts or pretty dead, and actually bringing life to these areas, transforming the surface of the planet through this project, through the movement of water, the new farming systems, and what have you. Now, this is something that often kind of gets under the skin of environmentalists, conservative people, because they think, well, this is something which is unnatural. Who are we as man to think that we can determine what goes on this planet? Who are we to say that it's better to have green as opposed to desert? Right? Who are we to say that we should control the flow of water that naturally goes into the oceans and bring it onto land? But in fact, what I'd like to go through a little bit now is that the quality of transformation which we're talking about is in fact the most natural process that has occurred on this planet. That the planet has always been controlled by a process of upward development, of moving towards higher forms of anti-entropic growth, largely under the influence of life itself. Now, probably one of the best case studies is what happened with the movement of life out of the oceans onto land. That people hopefully realize that the land was not always colonized with life. Life, as far as we understand, for the most part, started in the oceans, or at least developed most fully in the oceans. And the land was a pretty dry, dead place. Now, at a certain point, some 400 million years ago, life started to move out of the oceans and started to move on to colonize land. From the standpoint of how life existed in the oceans at that point, it was actually it seemed very counterintuitive that life would want to move on to land, because what life had to do to exist on land was much harder, much more difficult than how it existed in the oceans. In the oceans, everything was very sort of passive and easygoing. Food just sort of floated by. You could just kind of float along, gobble up some food. Reproduction was a pretty passive process. You just sort of throw your seed out there and see what sticks, so to speak. So life had a very kind of passive, not very energetic quality of existence. Obviously, it was surrounded with water, so water was not a concern, these kinds of things. To move on to land meant that now all of those things which were sort of passive in your environment, which you didn't have to seemingly think too much about, now became real issues. One, land was dry. So you had to think about, well, how do you maintain hydration? The reproductive process became much more difficult. You no longer just had this medium all around you that could facilitate the exchanges of fluids. Gaining of food was much harder. It didn't just float by the way it did in the oceans. So it seemed like the move onto land was the most impractical thing that life could have done at that time. But the thing is, in doing that, in doing what seemed to be the most impractical thing you could do, to realize the ability of life to succeed on land meant that life had to go through a succession of revolutions, had to actually introduce new types of what we might consider biological technologies, which in the overall effect was that it gave life a greater self-determination. Life was now more in control of its own processes. It had to create its own ability to reproduce, to gain food, to control the water cycle. And so now something which prior to that was kind of a passive effect of its environment on life, now life brought wholly under its control, became more of a self-determining process. And so as a result, you then had what were large deserts all over the globe became abundant with life, right? Life itself started to transform the surface of the planet, started to bring more life, started to bring the water cycle onto land, right? This whenever you started to see through things like something tantamount to what we've called the biological pump, to actually start to bring the water cycle off of the coast deeper and deeper into land, to where now, as we've discussed, water, which normally would just go right back into the oceans, was now being recycled, on the average of 2.7 times, something that we want to recreate with the NAWAPA process. So what we've seen is that in this, the natural tendency of processes on the earth was to bring more life, was to bring more development to the planet. You think about the effect of bringing life onto land and what that meant in terms of creating a greater energy throughput on the surface. Where now, because of the foliage on land, you now had, and photosynthesis, you're now capturing solar radiation. You're using that through life to do work. So now life was capturing the impinging solar radiation and using it to transform the surface of the planet, which then had the effect of producing the water cycle and accelerating weathering processes. And actually the effect was that through the action of life on land, it actually increased the flow of material back into the ocean. So the ocean life itself actually became more abundant because of the effects of life on land. And so you had this transformation process. It's very natural. And this is something that I think probably the first thing that we put out whenever we started discussing NAWAPA was the concept of biospheric engineering. That now what mankind is doing is now taking that process even further. We're now going to, through the control of the water cycle, through NAWAPA, we've discussed, we now have the potential to start to self-determine things like the weather cycles on the planet, to bring about rain cycles in areas that are otherwise dry. And through certain kinds of maybe control points in the NAWAPA system, we'll actually start to be able to determine on a global scale the weather cycles to make sure that areas which might go into drought phases, we actually control the cycle so that you don't go into the drought phases. Areas which might otherwise tend to flood, you control the system so that you mitigate the flooding process. And so man is now bringing into his control the entire process of global weather, of the global water cycle. And in doing this, we're actually doing what is the most natural aspect of what the planet has always tended towards, increasing the overall energy flux density of activity on the planet. But now the difference is that we're doing it as a willful function of the creative mind. Whereas no single living being has ever had or expressed a willful intention to bring about this transformation process. Right? The movement from the dinosaurs to the mammals was not an act of will on the part of these little rodents or something. Right? The dinosaurs, it was not an act of will to go extinct. The process as a whole seems to be controlled by a willful intention. There seems to be a tension driving the process as a whole. But you don't find that intention in any discrete entity within the living process. Now with man, it becomes completely different. That function, so to speak, that determines the entire biosphere can now be a function which is grasped by a single mind. A single human being can now actually grasp the entire function which has determined the development of the biosphere, for example, as a whole. And now can willfully act to say, hey, where must we be in the future? Where must mankind go? That now becomes the determinant of how we act today. We say, okay, we need to increase the number of people on the planet. We need to increase the living standards. We need to increase the creative potentials of our population. One of the ways we're going to do that is we have to act now from the standpoint of creating the sort of system that'll facilitate that, such as NAWAPA. But part of NAWAPA as a move towards the Arctic development, as a move towards the Moon-Mars mission, where what you'll find is that each phase of that development, the completion of NAWAPA will only be realized with the move towards the Arctic development. The completion of the Arctic development process will only be realized as a move towards the Moon-Mars mission. So it's always the future orientation which is actually completing any prior cycle that you're currently in. And so that's the kind of perspective that we have now, is that we're now in a position for man to gain control of his environment and to act willfully to move ourselves into the kind of future which is a wholly human future. No longer an oligarchically determined future, but a wholly human future.
Let me just pick you up on one point on this thing. Look what's happening here. Mankind is now moving toward taking over the solar system.
Right.
And we realize that in taking over the solar system, we have to deal with certain galactic processes, particularly those processes which we're familiar with in terms of living processes we know in this universe. So that's a similar kind of thing. Mankind has shown himself to be adapted to this mission. That is, mankind is not designed to be limited to living on Earth as human beings with some enhancement. Mankind is destined, inherently destined, because it's required. Mankind cannot continue to exist except by going to matter-antimatter processes now, more. But it means we're going to have to, instead of treating planets as planets, individual planets, we're going to have to look at this process as a process which mankind is evolving to a higher state in which we don't think of a planet as a limitation.
Right.
And in order to maintain this system, in order to deal with galactic processes which are menacing to us, we have to get a hold on this thing in terms of like the solar system. We have to get better control of the solar system. We have to move into the galaxy. So that mankind means a transition not to just a thinking being, which we are. And there is no other thinking being, really, we know of.
Right.
But mankind's functions of thought is in space. But it's not going out to space to colonize something as such in space. It's to take over space,
right.
Take over a planetary system, bring a planetary system under control. We get an approximation of this with the matter-antimatter reactions. We're then going into a domain of density, of energy flux density, which is beyond anything that mankind has ever envisioned before. And this whole solar system is going to come under our control.
Right.
That's the necessary goal. Otherwise, our mission as human beings wouldn't exist. It would terminate. It's more than that, actually, because mankind, in going into these higher orders of magnitude, we're showing that there's the process that drives us is not something coming from the past into the into the present. It's a process which is going inherently into the future. That is, the intention of mankind's existence is located not within mankind's existence, but an intention which lies beyond what we define as mankind's existence. We are, in other words, all evolution is actually going to a higher form which is not produced from the past to the future. It's from the future to the present. Well, the point is, you have to say the universe is dominated by a noetic principle.
Yeah.
And we are infected in part of the process of that noetic principle. If we consent to be part of that process. If we don't consent to be part of that process, we are finished. If we go green, the human species is going extinct. And that's the real issue here.
Yeah. If we go green, we go from being a species to a feces.